When my mother called me into the living room on a cold Saturday morning, she had that expression on her face, that one of her wacky ideas, or one that typically produced trouble. Our canine Max was wagging his tail at her feet as if he knew something exciting was about to happen. At first, I believed she was just asking me to take him for a walk or assist with some training. But what she said next left me stunned. "Get your phone," she said, with an odd smile on her lips. "We're going to record something with Max today." At first, I believed it was just another one of her do-it-yourself videos for social media, which she loved sharing. Crazy antics or garish costumes. But this time there was a sadness in her voice that scared me. "What type of video was it?" I looked at Max, who was still young and joyful as ever, and she answered in a dismissive but firm tone, saying, "Just trust me on this. It's going to be good for all of us." I couldn't get rid of the feeling that whatever she was thinking wasn't as innocent as she made it seem, because my mom was always pushing boundaries and chasing the next big idea. She had a way of making things seem innocent until you were in the middle of them, wondering how you got there. Supplies Max looked up at me with his large brown eyes as I sat on the couch and stroked my hand over his smooth fur. He was completely blind to the weird setting in the room. "What do you think she's up to, buddy?" I muttered when Max didn't comprehend what I was saying. He simply tilted his head like he always did. A few minutes later, my mom came back with a tiny box and her phone. Her little smile grew as she placed everything on the table. "All right," she said, slapping her hands together. "Let's get started." I had no idea what was going to happen, but I was certain that it would be something I would always remember. I watched as my mom carefully opened the small box she had carried into the room, and within were a few very strange items. A small tripod for her phone, a colorful bandana, and a squeaky toy shaped like a hamburger. I wanted to believe her, but Max jumped up at the sight of the toy right away, and his tail was wagging even harder now. "What exactly are we doing?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but I could feel the knot in my stomach tighten. She looked at me with a glint in her eye, the kind she gets when she's really excited about something. "Trust me, it's going to be fun. And we'll have something cute to post." I couldn't help but notice how vague she was being. This wasn't the first time she had enlisted me in one of her ambitious projects. Last month, she had attempted to teach Max to sing along to a pop song for a TikTok challenge. But something about the way she kept avoiding my questions made my skin crawl. As she set up the tripod and changed the angle, she started humming to herself, completely at ease. Over her shoulder, she said, "Cute dogs. People eat this stuff up, and we could even start making some real money from it." I leaned back and sighed. I asked again, trying to sound positive, and she finally looked at me. Her expression softened slightly, and she said, "You and Max are going to act out a scene. It'll be cute, I promise. A skit." My mom had always been obsessed with going viral, as if internet fame could solve all our problems since Dad left. She had been juggling side hustles to make ends meet ever since Dad left, and I couldn't really blame her for wanting something more. But using Max didn't sit right with me. She didn't respond straight away, but her smile remained constant as I raised an eyebrow again. I looked at Max, who appeared to be as happy as ever, but I couldn't get rid of the feeling that this was going to get much more complicated than I had anticipated. As my mom finished tying the bandana around Max's neck, she began setting up her phone and positioning the tripod. Her methodical and focused movements gave me the impression that I was the only person in the room who was wondering about this whole thing. Finally breaking the stillness, she remarked, "Here's the deal," and Max, as usual, just sat there chewing on the toy and wagging his tail. "We're going to pretend like a young person and their dog in the middle of a funny challenge, both being filmed by a camera." The teenager looks surprised while the dog is trying to perform a trick, with toys and treats scattered around. The scene takes place in a bright and cheerful living room. The mystery, then she smiled, clearly happy that I wasn't arguing anymore. "It's simple. Max is a detective, trying to find the missing burger toy." I looked down at Max, who was contentedly chewing the same hamburger toy. "You mean the one he already has?" And she waved her hand as if I hadn't got it. "That's just the setup. We'll take it away, hide it somewhere, and film him looking for it, and then you'll assist him along the way like his partner." It seemed innocuous enough, but the way she kept using the word viral earlier made me uneasy. So I knew there had to be more to this as she went over the rest of the plan. Little parts caught my attention that didn't. Quite an amount. The more she talked, the more I understood how much work she had put into this. It wasn't just a fun idea. She'd been planning this for days or weeks. While it wasn't unusual for her to put her all into a project, this one felt different. Why does it feel like there's more to this than you're telling me? I finally asked, narrowing my eyes at her. She froze for a brief, barely perceptible moment before laughing it off. She had already chosen specific locations to film, places where Max was supposed to find clues. She had even hidden a small bag of tools. Off. Don't overthink it. She claimed it was just for fun. But as we began filming, Max played his part flawlessly, sniffing around and wagging his tail like the cutest detective in the world. The more I did as my mother instructed, the more I realized there was definitely more to this. Do you think this will impress them? She muttered under her breath, barely loud enough for me to catch impress who I asked, stopping me in my tracks. Her face went pale for a moment before forcing a smile. The stranger made me reshoot scenes, changing angles, and insisting we get it just right. Nobody, it's nothing. Let's simply continue. But I could sense she was concealing something. And whatever it was, it went beyond a straightforward video. Even Max seemed to notice the increased tension in the room. He stopped wagging his tail and looked up at me as if to ask if everything was all right. I wanted to ask her questions, but I knew better than to push too hard because my mom wasn't the kind to share unless she was ready. And whatever this was, she was obviously not ready to talk about it for the time being. I had to comply, but I couldn't get rid of the thought that this amusing little video was going to lead to something much bigger and far more complicated than either of us had anticipated. As the filming progressed, the atmosphere in the room became more tense, and every time I asked a question, my mom's excitement was replaced with a sense of urgency. She would either brush it off or redirect my attention back to the mystery we were creating. Max Ever, the happy-go-lucky dog, seemed to sense the change as well, pacing between takes and looking from me to my mom with a nervous, and the chairs were marked with what appeared to be a random string of numbers. She gave me the paper and told me to act shocked when Max found it. I asked, holding up the paper. It's just part of the story, she said, avoiding eye contact. But why shouldn't the numbers be connected to the missing toy? This is known as building suspense. Her tone cut me off for the moment, but the unease in my chest was growing as she responded, now trust me, it will make sense later. This wasn't just a lighthearted, enjoyable video anymore. It was beginning to feel like a puzzle where I was missing too many pieces to understand the larger picture. As we kept filming, small details started to stand out. My mom was more tense than normal, yelling at me for small indiscretions, or stumbling over her words when I asked her about the next scene. She constantly checking her phone for texts, which she immediately concealed when I tried to see. While she adjusted the tripod and set up the ideal shot, I noticed her phone light up on the patio table. The screen briefly displayed a notification about an upcoming event. Eventually, we moved to the backyard for what she called the grand finale. The idea was for Max to solve the mystery by discovering the hamburger toy buried in a pile of leaves. As we kept filming, small details started to stand out. My mom was more tense than normal, yelling at me for small indiscretions, or stumbling over her words when I asked her about the next scene. She constantly checking her phone for texts, which she immediately concealed when I tried to see. While she adjusted the tripod and set up the ideal shot, I noticed her phone light up on the patio table. The screen briefly displayed a notification about an upcoming event. Eventually, we moved to the backyard for what she called the grand finale. The idea was for Max to solve the mystery by discovering the hamburger toy buried in a pile of leaves. My heart fell when we met. Was she actually using this video for something else? Or was it simply about getting viral? Alright, let's end this up. Her voice was extremely high-pitched. Max didn't need much guidance, because he was already sniffing around the leaves and wagging his tail wildly. His love of that squeaky toy kept him going, but as he dug through the pile, he discovered a small black notebook. He barked excitedly and pawed at it until I intervened to get it. "What is this?" I said, holding it out, and my mother's expression briefly froze. She appeared alarmed, as if she hadn't prepared for this. "Just put that back," she muttered. Before she could stop me, I opened the notebook and began flipping through pages full of handwritten notes. Some were sloppy and difficult to read, but a few stood out: dates, names, and even numbers that matched the ones on the paper we'd found earlier. Mom. Her voice was shaking quickly, and she snapped, reaching for it, saying, "Why is it?" "It's nothing. Let's just stick to the plan," I remarked in a hushed voice. "What is this?" And she just stared at me without responding. Her look was one of frustration and terror. Max sat between us, his head cocked as though he sensed the tension rising. "It's complicated," she murmured at last, hardly audible above a whisper. It wasn't just a video anymore. It was something much bigger and more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. The name on the phone screen wasn't familiar, but the message underneath it sent a chill down my spine. "Ready for tonight. Don't forget the files. I didn't want you to find out like this." My mind was racing, but before she could explain, her phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with another notification. This time, I caught the sender's name, and that's when everything started to click. I gazed at the luminous text. The notebook remained stuck in my grasp. "What's happening, Mom?" I asked. "It's not what you think," she said, reaching for the notebook. "I'll explain everything, but you have to trust me." "Trust you?" I pulled back, clutching the notebook tighter. "You've been hiding all of this from me. What are you even doing with Max and this whole setup?" She took a step closer, her hands out as if she was trying to calm me down. "It's complicated, okay? I needed your help because people are watching," I repeated, my voice. "What do you mean, rising?" By observing before she could respond, Max began to bark once more. With his nose pressed against the leaf pile, he pawed frantically, revealing another object. This time, it wasn't a toy or anything innocuous. Instead, it was a little, glossy USB drive. Its surface was damaged, but it was still intact, so I took it up, wondering what it was and why it was concealed. As she gazed at the drive, her face turned pale. "That's what they want," she said softly, almost to herself. "Who's they?" I demanded. She hesitated, looking around as though someone might be listening, and then said, in a voice that was hardly audible above a whisper, "The people I'd been working with. The ones I was trying to impress with this video. It was never just about going viral. What does this have to do with Max?" As I passed this along, she gestured to the USB drive in my hand, indicating that it contained important information. Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just about social media or going viral. My mom had gotten herself into something much bigger and more dangerous. And before I could say anything else, I asked, my voice shaking, "Why drag me into it?" She said, "They're not just interested in a cute dog video," her voice cracking. "They wanted a cover, something innocent that." While Max's eyes were focused on the fence at the edge of the yard when he let out a deep growl that I had never heard from him before. "What's the matter with him?" I nodded, followed his gaze, and her expression changed to one of pure fear. "We don't have time for this," she said, grabbing my arm, "but we need to go now." "But go where? What are we running from? Not here." Her urgency was enough to get me moving. But as we turned towards the house, I saw something or someone standing just beyond the fence, a shadowy figure watching us still, and silent. Max growled louder, his body tense and ready. My mom froze, tightening her grip on my arm, and buried secrets turned into something much scarier. Whatever was going on, this was real, and we were right in the middle of it. The figure by the fence approached, emerging from the shadows. It was a man wearing dark clothes, with a hat covering part of his face. My mother's hand tightened around my arm as she whispered, "Stay behind me." The man stopped a few feet away and raised his hands to indicate he wasn't a threat. Calmly but firmly, Max continued, "I'm not here to hurt you. I just need the drive." My mom didn't budge. "Who I am." Max, sensing the tension, growled viciously, raising his hackles as if he were ready to defend us. "Sent you," she demanded, her voice stronger than I had anticipated, and he responded, "But things have changed. You've drawn too much attention, and they're not happy about it." I looked between them, my heart pounding, and I asked, "What's on this drive?" The man's gaze shifted to me, his expression hardening, and he said, "It's better you don't know." I said, "No," in a firm but flat voice. "You've dragged us into this mess, and I deserve to know what this is all about." The man hesitated, then sighed. "It's corporate data, admitting sensitive information about deals, contracts, and other things that could ruin some very powerful people. Although your mother consented to deliver it, it is now a duty of mine." Mom gave him a fierce look. She snapped, "You promised this would be clean. It was supposed to be," he replied sharply. But before she could reply again, "You compounded everything." I didn't consent to be followed or intimidated. My stomach fell when I turned to see two more figures emerge from the side of the house. Unlike the first man, who didn't try to make small talk, a shadow had shifted in the corner of my eye. My mother looked at me as one of them barked and handed it back. And now Max barked harder and stepped in front of me in a protective manner. She murmured, "Take Max on the drive," as I stammered, pushing me out the back door and saying, "I'll handle this." Her face was pale, but she was determined to leave. I objected, but the despair in her eyes told me there wasn't time for an argument. Before I could comprehend what was happening, she yelled, "No, I'm not leaving you." As Max and I ran through the house, I heard frantic and angry voices behind me, but I didn't turn around. My hands were shaking as I gripped the USB drive, and my mind was racing with questions. We ran out the front door and down the street, my heart thumping in my chest. Max stayed close, barking to keep my fear at bay, but as we turned a corner, a car screamed to a stop in front of us. For a moment, I thought we were trapped, but then the driver's window rolled down and, to my surprise, it wasn't a stranger, it was my mother. She cried, "Get in," and I didn't think twice. Max and I got into the car, and she drove away, leaving the house and the shadowy figures behind. "How did you?" I started, but she interrupted me later. She said, "Follow the road, we're not out of this yet." As the car drove through the night, my mom gave me her phone, and I saw an address in the notes. She said, "That's where we're taking the drive, they'll protect us." I opened the notes app and froze. The address wasn't just any office or safe house. It was our family cabin, a place we hadn't. The man who had abandoned us years ago was somehow connected to all of this. The answers I thought I was getting only led to more questions as we drove into the darkness. One thing became clear. This wasn't over by a long shot. The cabin came into view just as the first light of dawn crept in. She looked at me, perplexed, and her expression was unreadable. "Because your dad is the only one who can fix this." The sight of it above the horizon brought back memories of my dad carrying me on his shoulders, and summer campfires that I hadn't considered in years, when I was too exhausted to walk back from the lake. But those memories were there when we pulled up. Max barked softly, his tail wagging uncertainly, and my mom turned to face me. Her face was lined with exhaustion, but she firmly said, "I'll talk to him first." I replied, gripping the USB drive tightly, "If he's involved in this, I deserve to hear it too." She hesitated, but eventually nodded, and we walked up the creaky wooden steps and knocked on the door. It swung open before we could knock stepped aside to allow us entry into the cabin, which appeared to be exactly the same as if time had stopped on the day he left my mom. Without wasting any time, he held up the USB drive there. She then said, "We need your help." He sighed heavily and ran a hand through his graying hair. "I told you not to get involved," he muttered, glaring at my mom. "Don't you dare pin this on me," she said. "You're the one who left us to deal with the fallout." My dad gave me a long look, his face softening. "You're old enough," I asked, barely a whisper. "Now they know you're involved." He said, looking at my mom, "We have to end this together." After hours of working on a plan, my dad called a contact he trusted, saying that the drive finally contains evidence of illegal deals from my old company. When I found out, I tried to expose them, but they threatened you both, so I left to keep you safe.